I would prefer not to.
Hello and welcome to episode 50 of Soho Bites. Soho Bites is the podcast in which we talk about Soho and the films that are set there. My name is Dominic DeLargy, and I feel like I should have done something about the whole episode 50 thing, made a bit of a thing of it. But I didn't, so, anyway, just a number. Also, I've had a bit of a cold and I've been feeling a bit sorry for myself. So, and apologies if my voice is a bit scratchy or I sound a bit bunged up. Boo-hoo, me. But I'll do something special for episode 100, I promise, which will be coming out in May 2030. So, put that in your diaries. You'll be able to listen to that on your way to work in your hover car. Our film for this month nearly didn't qualify as a Soho film under the very strict rules laid down by the SBQC, the Soho Bites Qualification Committee, because Bartleby from 1970 is mostly based near the Barbican. Luckily for our purposes, though, there are several scenes shot in a variety of locations all over London, including Hampstead, Euston, Brick Lane, the South Bank, Piccadilly Circus, and of course Soho, Great Windmill Street to be precise, as the title character, Bartleby, wanders the streets observing things. Bartleby was based on an 1853 short story called Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville, the author best known for writing Moby Dick. In Melville's story, a peculiar young man begins work at a Wall Street legal firm and soon begins to cause all sorts of trouble for his boss. In the film version, the 1970 film version that is, because there have been multiple adaptations over the years, the location's been changed to London, and it's been updated to 1970, and the legal firm is now an accountancy firm, but the central relationship between the troubled Bartleby and his exasperated boss remains true to Melville's short story. I'll be talking about Bartleby, its origins, and its wider cultural significance in the second half of the show when I meet film critic Stephen Armstrong. But before we get into that, it's time for a spot of true crime. Because, as everybody knows, the big bucks in the podcasting world are to be earned in the true crime market, because that's what people want to listen to. Friend of the show, Murder Mile Mike from the Murder Mile podcast, lives on a super yacht with loads of naked supermodels, probably. And do you think he achieved that lifestyle by podcasting about films set in Soho? No, because he's not an idiot. He podcasts about true crime and has to move his cash about with a JCB, and I want a bit of that. Now, in Herman Melville's story, Bartleby the Scrivener, upon which our film is based, the unnamed narrator, the lawyer in that version, has a line which intrigued me.
I remembered the tragedy of the unfortunate Adams, and the still more unfortunate Colt in the solitary office of the latter, and how poor Colt, being dreadfully incensed by Adams, and imprudently permitting himself to get wildly excited, was at unawares hurried into his fatal act, an act which certainly no man could possibly deplore more than the actor himself.
What on earth was he talking about? Who are Adams and Colt? They're not characters previously mentioned in the book, so why was Melville bringing them up? Obviously, I thought, this is a reference to something his readers in 1853 would have understood, so being an obsessive looker-upper of stuff, I quickly discovered what this was all about, and it's a doozy. A true story of murder in 19th century New York, a bizarre attempt to hide the crime, a sensational trial which is reported on a daily basis to a slavering public by a scurrilous tabloid press, a romance, a suicide, a bit more death and destruction, and then decades of conspiracy theories, and all of this surrounding one of the country's most famous and celebrated families. This is the unfortunate story of John C. Colt and Samuel Adams. I mentioned that the story involved one of America's most famous families, and you may well have heard of Samuel Adams. He was one of the country's so-called founding fathers and a signatory on the Declaration of Independence, but the Samuel Adams in this story is not that Samuel Adams. In fact, of the two people mentioned by Herman Melville, the famous one is actually John C. Colt, and he's famous because he's the brother of Samuel Colt, who, among other things, invented the Colt 45, the first mass-produced handgun, the gun that won the West. But to be fair to John, he too had a claim to fame. He was a sort of celebrity accountant. I'm not even joking. He wrote a book about accountancy, specifically on the subject of double-entry bookkeeping, and he toured the country giving lectures about it. And people went to see him talk. It's absolutely wild.
Double-entry bookkeeping is an accounting system where every financial transaction is recorded in at least two accounts, a debit and a corresponding credit, ensuring the accounting equation, assets equals liabilities plus equity, always balances. This method improves accuracy, reduces fraud, and provides a complete view of a company's financial health.
But John, often in the shadow of his younger, more successful brother, was something of a black sheep. He was born in 1810, and in the years before becoming this rock star accountant, had led a fairly chaotic life, not helped by various family tragedies which had pushed him off course. He moved around a lot from job to job, setting up short-lived businesses in different parts of the country, and at one point enlisted in the US Marine Corps before faking illness to get himself a discharge soon after. By 1841, though, in his early 30s, it appeared that John's life was on more of an even keel. He seems to have settled in New York, and his book on double-entry bookkeeping, which was called
The Italian Science of Double-Entry Bookkeeping, Simplified, Arranged, and Methodized,
was a great success. His, to use an outdated term, common-law wife was expecting his first child. It was all looking rosy for John C. Colt. Except for the fact that, despite his skills as an accountant, he wasn't actually very good at handling money, and he had debts. One such debt was owed to Samuel Adams. Not much is known about Samuel Adams, except that he was the printer who had printed Colt's books, and that he was owed money for doing this. On the afternoon of September 17th, 1841, Adams went round to Colt's office at 82 Nassau Street in Lower Manhattan to request payment on the outstanding debt. The amount owed, according to Adams, was $57.15, a little over $2,000 in today's money. Colt, however, disputed the amount, countering that the actual bill only amounted to $55.80, a difference of $1.35. According to Colt, in a letter he later wrote, spoiler alert, from prison,
he accused me at once with an intent of cheating him, to which I calmly replied that I was astonished he should say so, and requested him to give me some reasons for warranting such a charge. Word followed word, and in the meantime, I drew his account from my portfolio.
Colt claimed that he attempted to reason with Adams, showing him evidence of various payments to back up his argument, but to no avail.
At this, he became exasperated and gave me a slap with the back of his hand across the mouth, which you may be assured was returned in due justice, as I sprang to my feet in self-defense. He almost instantly seized hold of my neckcloth, which placed me in his power. Pressing me to the table and wall, he struck me 3 or 4 times in the breast.
Now, clearly this is only one side of the story, but neighbours in the building did testify later to hearing some very loud noises. We only have Colt's version of how the fighting began, though, because only Colt came out of it alive. As the scuffle escalated, Colt finds himself pinned over his desk, and he gropes around for a weapon with which to defend himself. He was known to assemble the wooden packing crates for his books in the office, so the tools for doing this were scattered around.
The last distinct recollection I have was that of trying to press him off with my left hand as I held to his collar, endeavoring with my right hand at the same time to raise myself from the table as he had me pressed over backwards upon it. It was in this painful position I seized that accursed hatchet and gave him the unfortunate blows I did. When relieved from his horrid grasp, I beheld for the first time my awful defense. Heaven only knows the number of blows I struck him. There may have been 4 or 5, and when I reflect upon the instrument most unfortunately seized and instantaneously used, it is only to be wondered that his head was not dashed into 1,000 pieces.
So, Adams is dead, and despite Colt marvelling at how little damage was done, relatively speaking, considering he'd just been whacked in the head 4 or 5 times with an axe, it must have been a pretty gruesome sight to behold. I'm sure that John C. Colt didn't wake up that morning planning to stove somebody's head in, and I can imagine that he must have been in a state of some discombobulation, but even if you're not thinking clearly in the heat of the moment, the sensible thing to have done at this stage would have been, surely, to notify the authorities. Come clean, explain he'd been acting in self-defence, get lawyered up and defend himself in court. But guess what? That is not what he decided to do. Instead, he cleaned the office, removing as much evidence of the killing as he could. He then trussed Adams's body up like a turkey, stuffed him into one of the wooden packing crates, packed the body in salt and nailed the crate shut. To remove the body from the office, he came up with a cunning plan. He prepared the crate for transportation and addressed it to a probably fictitious recipient, a Mr. Gross in New Orleans. He engaged the services of a passing cart driver called Richard Barstow, who took the crate to the docks, where it was loaded onto a freight ship called the Kalamazoo, which was due to sail south with the morning tide. Job done. It wasn't long, though, before Adams's family and staff grew concerned for his safety, and in the September 22nd edition of the New York Sun, the following small ad appeared.
Any information respecting Mr. Samuel Adams, printer, who left his place of business on Friday, September 17th, about 3:00 p.m., will be thankfully received by his relatives and friends at number 23 Catherine Street, who are unable to account for his sudden disappearance. From an investigation of his business, there does not appear to be an assignable cause for his absence. The only conjecture is that he has met with some violence, but when, or in what manner, is still a mystery.
On the day the notice was published, presumably to cover his tracks, Colt took the short walk to Samuel Adams's print shop and spoke with his bookbinder, Charles Wells. He expressed concern for Adams and said several times, "What could have become of him?" "I don't know," said Mr. Wells. "The last I saw of him, he was going to see you." Another person who saw the ad in the New York Sun that day was Mr. Asa Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler occupied the office next door to Colt's, and on the day of the killing was engaged in some private tuition with a 16-year-old student called Arzak Sinyet. Upon hearing a loud noise coming from next door, he interrupted the lesson and crept out into the hall. He peered through the keyhole and saw what he thought to be a man with his coat off, bending over a person who was lying on the floor. Concerned, but seemingly not overly so, he returned to his student. After seeing the ad a few days later, Wheeler made contact with Adams's father-in-law, Joseph Lane, and told him of his concerns. Eventually, satisfied that something fishy was afoot, they contacted the authorities. I should perhaps have pointed out that the weather in New York throughout this whole business was horrendous, with constant torrential rain. Unfortunately for John C. Colt, this had delayed the departure of the good ship Kalamazoo and its hapless dead passenger in the packing crate, so it was still sitting in the dock, waiting for the weather to improve. Seamen aboard the ship noticed a foul smell coming from the crate and had initially put it down to rat poison, but eventually, with suspicion swirling, the crate was opened in the presence of dock officials and a city officer, and the grim discovery was made. After his inevitable arrest, Colt was held on remand while investigators searched his office. They discovered that he appears to have tried to cover up blood spots on the axe, floor and walls with splats of ink from a pen. They also found Adams's pocket watch with some of Colt's possessions. John C. Colt does not seem to have been very good at being a criminal. Being from a wealthy and well-connected family, Colt did not have to worry about costs when it came to his trial 4 months later, as the tab was picked up by his family. The trial was a sensation in the newspapers, particularly the penny press, a new type of cheap tabloid specialising in overwrought crime and human interest stories for a mass market. Having the famous name was juicy enough, but added to this was the gruesome nature of the killing, the absurdly bungled cover-up, and the facts and myths of Colt's bohemian private life. Colt was presented as a rake and a womanizer who had led the life of a riverboat gambler. He was unmarried and cohabited openly with his pregnant girlfriend, Caroline Henshaw, and for many editors, the case wasn't just news, it was an opportunity for sanctimonious preaching. Sermonising and commentary mingled with the sex and the gore, turning the trial into a broader debate about personal morality and the new, modern lifestyles. It was also, of course, very profitable, as crowds of people hungry for ever more lurid detail would crowd newspaper stands, snapping up every new edition of the various 1-cent tabloids. The trial began on January 13th, 1842. At that time in New York, a conviction for first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence of death. Colt had admitted to killing Adams, so the argument put forward by his defence counsel was that Colt had acted in self-defence and that it was therefore manslaughter. The subsequent concealment of the facts and the ludicrous plan to transport the body to Louisiana, they put that down to temporary insanity. His team also protested to the judge about the hostile newspaper coverage, claiming that it was bound to prejudice the jury against their client, and petitioned him to intervene, but he declined to do so. There being no legal mechanism for the judge to interfere with the activities of the press, he merely insisted that the jury must ignore what they had read. The prosecution went in hard and argued that this was a premeditated murder. This was based partly on Colt's actions following the killing and partly on his demeanour in the court, which was said to be unremorseful and not typical of an innocent man. After an 11-day trial and 10 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. John C. Colt was found guilty of willful murder. Ever since his arrest in September 1841, Colt had been held at a detention centre within the Halls of Justice, nicknamed the Tombs, a pretty horrible place despite looking like a Las Vegas hotel from the outside, and there he returned while the lengthy appeals process began. Thanks to his family's deep pockets, however, Colt lived a life of relative luxury during his confinement. According to reports at the time, he occupied a cell to himself which was carpeted and contained upholstered furniture, a writing desk, books and curtains. He also ate food sent in from outside and was able to enter into correspondence with his family and the press and members of the public. In his letters, he condemned the penny press as
consummate scoundrels,
and complained that
12 men, either from error or prejudice, trampled upon the evidence. They trampled upon the judge's charge. They trampled upon the law. For the law says when there is a doubt, it should be given in favor of the prisoner. It is now well known that several of them either willfully or unguardedly expressed hostile opinions before the trial.
And also that
I did but defend myself against a wanton, vile, and unpardonable attack. This I would do again, at any time, when insulted or assaulted. No man would do less. His very nature compels him to this. I have been tried and condemned for endeavoring to secrete a misfortune, not for killing a man.
By late September 1842, a little over a year after that unfortunate business with the axe, his last hope of reprieve had failed. An execution date of November the 18th was set, with a hanging to take place within the grounds of the Halls of Justice where Colt was being held. Arrangements were made for John and Caroline, who had by this stage given birth to their son, to be married on the day of his hanging. At noon, the small ceremony took place in Colt's cell, officiated by Reverend Dr. Henry Anton. In attendance were John's famous brother Samuel, one friend, and a handful of officials. John and the distraught Caroline were given a few moments alone to say goodbye, and then, sobbing convulsively, Caroline was led away by her new brother-in-law. Despite the temperature on that day not once climbing above freezing, the crowds had begun to gather outside the prison before dawn. By 8 a.m, a full 8 hours before the scheduled hanging time, the streets around the building were blocked with thousands of people. By noon, the courtyard in which the gallows had been erected for this ticket-only event was so full that late arrivals could be heard complaining that Colt was not to be hung high enough for those at the back of the crowd to see him. By early afternoon, every rooftop in the area was crammed with spectators hoping for a view of the courtyard, and despite these thousands of people waiting for hours in the biting cold, there was apparently a holiday atmosphere, with some people, according to the New York Commercial Advertiser, buoyant with the ecstasy of anticipation. As the allotted time approached, a tense silence fell upon the courtyard, and all eyes were trained towards the door from which the condemned man was due to emerge. Suddenly, with none of the decorum expected at such a solemn moment, the door was flung open and an officer of the court stumbled into the yard shouting, "He's committed suicide! Colt is dead in his cell!" For just a few moments earlier, when officials had gone to collect Colt for his last journey, they'd found him lying on his bed, his shirt soaked in blood, with a knife protruding from his heart. Before the crowd had time to take this in, another voice from somewhere in the crowd screamed, "The prison is on fire! The prison is on fire!" Panic spread through the yard as flames and smoke began to billow from the prison roof, and then, to add to the pandemonium, as the spectators from the yard tried to escape into the street, the main prison doors succumbed to the sheer weight of numbers outside, and hundreds of people, unaware of the fire, streamed in. What had begun merely as a palaver had rapidly turned into a kerfuffle and was now a fully fledged hullabaloo. The fire spread rapidly, but the panicking crowd somehow managed to escape. What passed for a fire brigade in those days did what they could to deal with the blaze, but after a few hours, much of the building lay in ruins. Remarkably, there was only one fatality officially reported that day, John C. Colt, who had cheated the hangman by taking his own life with a penknife. This, it was assumed, was smuggled in either by Caroline or by another member of the party attending the marriage ceremony. This explanation, though, was not good enough for the mob. Even as the collapsed timbers of the prison lay smouldering, conspiracy theories began to circulate. The timing of the fire seemed suspicious, they thought. The dead man, the theory went, was not John C. Colt at all, but some unfortunate inmate murdered by Colt and dressed in his clothes. Well-connected and powerful associates of Colt had started the fire as a distraction, and Colt had mingled with the crowd and escaped. More fuel was added to this metaphorical fire by the fact that Colt's body was buried with unseemly haste, and rumours circulated that Caroline Henshaw and her son left for California almost immediately and was living there under an assumed name, awaiting the arrival of John in disguise. In a way, this was the best outcome the penny press could have hoped for, because it became the story that just kept giving. There were rumoured sightings of John and Caroline in the following months and years. Another rumour was that Caroline had eloped with a Prussian prince, and that the child was not John's but Samuel's. All of it hogwash, of course, but, to misquote Winston Churchill, "A juicy fat conspiracy theory can get halfway around the world before the truth has even got its underpants on." On January 31st, 1842, the New York Sun put out an extra edition all about the John C. Colt case, laying out the grisly details. I put a link to a scan of that edition in the show notes for your delectation. And thank you to Troy Taylor for reading those lines from John C. Colt's letters and testimony in that very convincing American accent. There's some more detail about Troy's work at the end of the show, and also in the show notes, of course. Find all of that at sohobitespodcast.com. That groovy music you're hearing there is by jazz composer Roger Webb and is part of the brilliant soundtrack composed for this month's film, Bartleby. As previously mentioned, Bartleby is a 1970 British adaptation of Herman Melville's 1853 short story, Bartleby the Scrivener, or, to give it its full title, Bartleby the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street. It was the only feature film to be directed by Anthony Friedman, who also wrote the screenplay along with Rodney Carr-Smith, and stars John McEnery in the title role and Paul Schofield as his boss. This boss, in common with most other characters in the film, is never referred to by name and is simply listed as the accountant in the credits. This wasn't the only version of the story to be made in 1970, as there was another one that year produced in France. Previous versions had been made in 1957, 1962 and 1969. Then there were those two in 1970, then two more in 76 and one in 77. After this 20-year flurry of Bartlebys, there was a pause for a while until we hit the 21st century, when it was made again in 2001, 2010, 2013, 2016 and 2017, and I think there were more. There were certainly some stage and radio adaptations along the way. Some of the films were made in different languages, at least one was animated, some were shorts, some were made for TV, some were set in the original period and location, and some were updated. But they all have the same basic story, the same central relationship at the heart of that story, and the same key line of dialogue. I would prefer not to, which is said by the title character Bartleby frequently throughout the film as he passively resists all requests to do any work. Something about this story has resonated with people in different times and places for nearly 200 years. The world we find ourselves in as the film starts could be compared to Chaplin's Modern Times, but rather than people being fed into enormous machines, the thousands of grey-faced commuters we see walking to and from their London offices are actually what constitute the machine. In an opening montage of Bartleby's attempts to find a job within this enormous mundane system, we see him struggling to cross a footbridge as an irresistible wave of humanity walks in the opposite direction. Shots of post office sorting machines and old-style computers are intercut with images of the populace moving docilely from place to place, and Bartleby attempting to navigate a world he doesn't comprehend. The story of Bartleby is often presented as being about noble passive resistance to this meat grinder existence. One man standing up to faceless corporate bureaucracy. But that's not really what I took from it. From Bartleby's first meeting with the accountant when being interviewed for the position of audit clerk, we see that the boss is not a monster at all but a perfectly nice man, and it's difficult to escape the conclusion that Bartleby's extreme passivity is not so much an act of defiance as an inability to communicate. When I use film clips in the podcast, I usually trim down pauses a bit so they make a bit more sense in an audio format. But here, I've left the timing exactly as it appears in the film.
Sit down, sit down. You're looking for a position as audit clerk here. Tell me, have you ever done this kind of work before?
Yes.
I see. Where have you worked before?
I worked in the post office, in the dead letter section.
Oh, really? How interesting. I've often wondered what happens to letters that can't be delivered and can't be returned. But what does all this have to do with accounting?
Nothing. I was going to say I was then transferred to the controller's department as an audit clerk.
Good. So you've had experience with accounts and bookkeeping.
I was an audit clerk.
Well, work here is on a smaller scale, as some of our larger clients require all our resources. I take it you're familiar with double entry bookkeeping, but have you had experience with computer-based accounts and programming?
Initially, Bartleby works diligently in his new job, despite having no interaction with the other office workers who think he's a bit weird, and he seems to be doing very well, until one day...
Bartleby! Bartleby, come in here and bring in the Preble file, will you please?
I would rather not. Just now.
The following day, there is another small refusal,
I would prefer not to.
and then another. The accountant's reaction to this is one of perplexity. I would prefer not to does not have the ring of rebellion about it, but it's clearly a refusal to do as he's instructed nonetheless. How is the accountant supposed to deal with these acts of courteous insubordination? He flip-flops between irritation with a dash of embarrassment thrown in, because these small acts of defiance are often done in full view of other employees, and concern for Bartleby's well-being, whose behaviour is concerning. His fellow unnamed executive, played by Thorley Walters, knows full well what he would do.
Why don't you just sack him? Could I have a sugar, please?
Sack him? Well, I know it seems the most obvious solution, but I can't quite bring myself to do it. He's so utterly civil, so dignified. And he's actually a most efficient worker, except he refuses to do certain things from time to time. It's a sort of passive resistance.
Oh, yes? Well, what's he against?
Nothing. Nothing.
Things take a darker turn when the accountant begins to realise that Bartleby is homeless and is living in the office. So it's with great reluctance that he eventually decides that he has no alternative but to sack him and says he must leave. Bartleby reacts to this by saying that he would prefer not to, because being sacked is not convenient right now, and he continues to stay seated at his desk doing no work. The final scenes between the two men take place in the grounds of a sanatorium where Bartleby is receiving some type of treatment. It's not clear if he's being confined there against his will, or perhaps he could leave, but would prefer not to. The film is extremely true to the spirit of the source material despite being set in a different country nearly 120 years later. The book is narrated by the boss, and the story is told solely from his point of view, retrospectively with an air of perplexed sadness. The main difference when it comes to the film is that we're given a certain amount of insight into Bartleby's interior life. He takes long walks around London observing things, people, architecture, statues, and he has a few lines spoken to himself that hint at his inner struggles.
I'm not afraid to talk to myself. Everybody does. But they don't hear themselves. And they're afraid to hear one another.
To talk about Anthony Freedman's Bartleby, I was joined in my usual recording space, the gallery of the Museum of Soho at 75 Dean Street, by Stephen Armstrong. Stephen is a journalist at The Observer, freelance writer and film critic, and a podcaster. In fact, he makes a podcast about a very Soho subject. Details about that at the end. We started the conversation by speculating about how Herman Melville came up with the character of Bartleby. So the film is based on the book Bartleby the Scrivener from 1853. When he wrote it, Herman Melville, he was not in the greatest stage of his life or career.
No.
Is Bartleby Melville?
Well, I think he is. Because he'd gone on a big adventure early on in his life. He'd stayed on an exotic island and come back and written a sort of a Robinson Crusoe-style book, which had made him a big sensation. But he didn't really like this kind of trashy fiction, so he wanted to write great literature. So drawing again on his one great big experience of life, he wrote Moby Dick. In later years, long after he was dead, this became his defining work, Moby Dick, which drew on his experiences of being out at sea and drew on his understanding of ships. But it was critically panned and nobody read it. As he was sort of considering what he was going to do, he started working as some form of clerk. It wasn't a clerk, it was something similar. He wasn't a scrivener, he wasn't a clerk. He was working in admin somewhere, very strange. And he started writing short stories, and he wrote 4 short stories, of which one of them was Bartleby the Scrivener. And then he gave up writing. Basically, he started writing poetry and vanished off to a farm somewhere and spent the rest of his life in obscurity, writing poetry that nobody read. And then it was after he was dead that everyone rediscovered Moby Dick. But Bartleby the Scrivener is sort of the novelette, which is him checking out. It's a story of a man whose job it is to read and write and
copy things over and over again, isn't it?
And eventually decides, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. And the phrase, I prefer not to, then
I would prefer not to.
Prefer not. And I think in a way that's Melville going, do you know what, I'm not going to do this anymore. It's an interesting book because it also comes at the point, that book, where the job of Scrivener is beginning to become replaced by technology. There's a technological thing ongoing. And actually in the film, there's a really interesting and really understated sequence where the Bartleby of the film walks past these banks of computers in a window. And of course, the job that he's doing, the petty accounting job that he's doing, is about to be taken over by the computers. So it's very, very, very sort of, unspoken references to the scene and the setup of the short story all features in the most unexpected ways in the film.
And in fact, Paul Scofield's character does say, are you familiar with computerized accounting? As though there's another type of that now,
And then that's not quite, the question isn't answered. He doesn't answer that question. He says something about it's all in my application.
Doesn't answer any questions at all, does he?
No.
So the film that we're talking about is by far not the first adaptation of the story. There were lots of versions before, on stage, on radio, and other film adaptations.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, Bartleby has had possibly more cultural reach, perhaps, than Moby Dick. I mean, we've all heard of Moby Dick, but Bartleby, and in particular this phrase, I would prefer not to, has this enormous cultural impact. I mean, you can go online now and buy T-shirts which say I prefer not to. I was friends with the Idler magazine, and they would use I would prefer not to as a sort of a slogan of anarchic resistance. And there was a series of 12 lectures by different architectures under the title I would prefer not to, which is about architectural resistance at certain key moments in their careers. The phrase, the impact, the idea that Bartleby has by saying this thing has been huge.
And people don't know where it's from.
No.
It is a phrase that I have seen it on T-shirts. I've seen it
Occupy
on signs. Occupy Wall Street, yeah. But there are two ways, well, as I see it, there are broadly two ways of reading the film and or the story through that kind of resistance thing. But when I saw the film the first time, I thought, oh, he's mentally unwell. He's having he could be on the autistic spectrum and almost definitely depressed as well. And the film, it does have that resistance element to it, because it suggests that he's fighting against the sort of tedium, the humdrum nature of his boring work. But also, he just presents as depressed.
I think the film plays into the ambiguity on that with the way that it shoots working life in London. So we see him arrive and he is on a tube, then he's through very busy streets. Everything is grey. He's going up and down these grey concrete walkways. So the whole idea of being in this world is depressing, I think. It's when he walks off down streets which are covered in litter. There's nothing about the experience that he's having that would give him any joy anyway. Everything seems dull and boring and monotonous, and it is crushed by the wheels of industry style portrayal of office life. So you can see that both these things can be equally true. He can be resisting the mundanity of his existence in a not explicitly political way, but in a way where he's pushing against the idea of this terrible life he's managed to stumble into. On the other hand, this world in some ways is depressing him, and maybe he does have ADHD, or maybe he does have a form of Asperger's, but we never get the diagnosis. We just have to make jumps about what we think they're showing. There are these elements in the film where there's, in particular, Paul Scofield's character is incredibly sympathetic and touched in the heart by this man. He knows there's something that more than just sort of an insolent, bad-tempered employee. He's trying to reach out to him, and he can't make connection with him.
Yeah, I think Paul Scofield's performance is beautiful. I just think it's so kind of nuanced, and you can kind of see, without it being telegraphed, you can see all his kind of internal struggles. He's quite a pompous guy in a three-piece suit and everything, but actually he does have compassion for this this poor little weedy fella. And I think that comes directly from the book as well, because he
Yes.
does say in the book, there's all sorts of quotes in the book. I'll put those in the show notes. He just has that sort of Christian compassion for him, you know.
But I think there's also this, both with the short story, but with the film, there is this fascination that in the film he's just called the accountant has with this man who turns up, Bartleby. So he welcomes him into the office. Bartleby turns up for a job. We have in the film, we have the sense that he's been at something to do with the post office. We get the sense, which eventually is explained, that he worked for the dead letter office, which is where letters that can't be delivered go. He's trying to get a job. He's walking around London. He's trying to phone people. No one's answering the phone. No one's giving him the information. Eventually, he just turns up and said, I've come about the job. And they said, it was a week ago, but okay, we still think it's open. And he's interviewed by the Paul Scofield character, who's quite sort of jolly in a way. This is a smaller firm, but, you know, we'll all pull together. And
It's his company, isn't it? I mean, it's not like he's not working. He hasn't got managers above him.
No, and he owns, you assume he owns it because he has lunch later on with other high-ranking accountancy folk.
In that terrible play, that executive dining room.
There's nothing in this
Awful.
that's attractive, is there? There's no one who you can
Dreadful
be with
place.
whatsoever.
Eating jam roly-poly, and it was like school dinners. Oh.
The whole thing is bleak in a way, and he's trying to jolly up during the interview. Well, this is the way we do things. But Bartleby is relentlessly downbeat throughout this interview. And there's something that then seems to touch him from then on, because right from the word go, as soon as Bartleby starts saying, actually, I would prefer not to, his instinctive response is to let him off. Okay, well, we'll get someone else to do it. He's always trying to make it work for Bartleby as much as he possibly can, right up until the very, very bitter end. I mean, he from the moment he meets him, he's taken by him. It's almost like a Pontius Pilate and Jesus kind of thing. Why won't you speak to me? It's very, very intriguing obsession that he starts to develop in a way.
I never thought of it that way.
I mean, actually, Pontius Pilate in that scene, he's always saying to Jesus, why won't you speak for yourself? Why won't you talk for yourself? And Jesus refuses to deal with Pontius Pilate. And he said, he's Herod's man, take him back to Herod. But he's hoping to help him in a way.
Because you don't get the sense that he's letting him off out of weakness or some kind of pathetic leadership skills. He senses there's something not happy about him. And that kind of goes backwards and forwards. There's a turning point when he discovers Bartleby's sad little life. He's got his shirt and his socks in the drawer. He's got like some crackers and cheese. There's a handkerchief with a few coins in it. I think there's a line about it in the book where he's just aghast, but it's all done without dialogue in the film. And he's absolutely appalled that he's living this life. And I think from then on, he tries to shake him off because he really ought to, but he follows him around.
The first thing he does after that is he asks, where are you from?
Yeah.
Do you want some time off? Do you need to relax? What do you need?
Go and see your people.
Yeah. After seeing this man who lives at his desk and sleeps on the couch, and as we will later find out, phones the speaking clock at night, and his heart reaches out to him, but Bartleby won't give him anything. He won't meet him halfway. And it's ambiguous again. This is the beautifully ambiguous story. There is the thing, well, what does the accountancy firm, and indeed what does the law firm in the original story do if you have an employee who will not work and will not leave their desk? When you say, well, we're going to fire you, and he's still there because he lives there. And so in both cases, what they do is they decide that instead of dealing with this problem, they're going to move the office somewhere else. And you can read that in a number of ways. One is the man is weak and he can't deal with Bartleby. He doesn't know how to go through the legal processes, but that's not to be believed, really. It'd be fairly easy because later on, we see that in the film, someone calls the police and they take him away. Off he goes, actually to a hospital where, he's got the option of food and whatever. But in a way, you get the feeling perhaps that he's leaving him the space. He's giving him the office. This is where you live now. This is the best I can do. I'm going to give you a check for 2 weeks. We're going to go. This is now where you want to be. I don't know what else to do for you anymore. I can't give you what you need.
It's a really touching moment where Bartleby's looking out the window. The office is completely empty, and Schofield kind of comes up behind him and just puts some money into his hand, and then sort of dilly-dallies and then walks off. It's really, really sad. It's the speaking clock moment is a moment that makes me kind of clutch my chest.
Yes.
That's so awful.
That's when you finally see the character tip from the question about, is this a moment of resistance, into, is this a moment of mental health crisis? Because until then, he could just be in a form of resistance, which then goes into an extremely stubborn, squatty, occupy this office sort of. You can read it that way all the way up until that moment where he's sitting alone at night, phoning the speaking clock. And at that point, you say, okay, there is much more to this than an act of resistance. There is something fundamentally at work here in this man's mind.
Yeah.
Why don't you listen to me?
I am listening to you.
Why don't you do what I ask?
I prefer not to.
Prefer not to. Well, at least give me an excuse, a reason why you insist on this attitude. Are you in trouble? Are you ill? I mean, has something happened? Give me some kind of explanation. Try to make me understand.
Please understand, whatever I say will not explain.
I didn't realise until I was looking at this, The Economist has a column called Bartleby.
Well, his reach is enormous, Bartleby.
Yeah.
His influence and his power is fundamental because it's that I would prefer. I think that's the thing about Bartleby. Bear in mind that both times this we're talking about, when Herman Melville is writing and when this film comes out, you're looking at a time of enormous industrial strife. So in America, you have the armed resistance of the Wobblies. In the UK, you're hitting the 70s, and there's huge labour disputes emerging. We're reaching the beginning of that very troublesome period between labour and management. Bartleby isn't of that school of thought. He says, I would prefer not to, if that's all right.
Yeah.
And it's
He's not actually saying no at all, is he?
And what do you do? How do you counter that? And there's something wonderful about being at the heart of the machine and saying, actually, I'd prefer not to do that, if that's okay. I mean, it'd be nicer if you could do that once or twice rather than everything that everyone asks you to. But it's an empowering sentence. I would prefer not to do that. And it's a very hard one to negotiate with.
He starts off with not wanting to do one thing,
Yeah.
then another thing. And then eventually he just says, I don't think I'll do any more accounting today.
yeah.
And then he says, I don't think I'll ever do accounting again.
Yes.
But he's not going to move out. There are some moments of kind of comedy. I think Paul Scofield brings a bit of comedy to it when his reactions are a little bit kind of, he doesn't know quite how to deal with it. And also some of Bartleby's lines, like he said, be reasonable. And Bartleby says, at the moment, I prefer not to be a little reasonable.
Yes. Yes.
But it's a little bit, it almost feels like laughing at somebody with Tourette's, because there is comedy in it. You can't help but laugh, but it is part of his kind of breakdown and deterioration.
Absolutely. If you just watch the film and you've never read that short story, it starts off quite funny. It starts off with Robin Asquith, who a couple of years after this film is made is going to start making the Confessions sex comedy series, which is sort of, Carry On style, slightly more bottoms.
It's weird that you don't see his bottom at all in this film. Robin Asquith, he's got his trousers on. What's going on?
And he comes in cheeky chappy, telling rude jokes,
Yeah.
and it's an extremely unusual ensemble that they put together. And it's a comedy ensemble in many ways. I mean, admittedly, Schofield and McKerney have both come from very serious dramatic, they have been known for very serious dramatic roles. I mean, John McKerney had relatively early in his career, and he'd just played Mercutio in Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet. And Mercutio is such a vibrant character, and Zeffirelli's version of Romeo and Juliet is explosive. So you've got him playing probably the most active character. I mean, Mercutio has the greatest agency in Romeo and Juliet. He's the one who's not swept away by anything. He just makes his decisions and dies for it. And he's full of life. And his next choice is to play someone who is almost motionless throughout the film. It's a really intriguing. These two actors have made this incredible choice to play these parts. The rest of the office are fairly standard. Robin Asquith is an interesting addition.
Yeah, Colin Jeavons.
Yeah.
Who I recognise, is one of those faces, I've definitely seen him in lots of stuff before. He tends to play Misers in Dickens.
He's kind of a that guy sort of
Yeah.
actor, isn't he? Who's that guy? And there's a lot of that guy's in this film.
Yeah.
I think one of the doctors is of that guy as well. So
Yeah, and Thorley Walters, his chum in the terrible executive dining room, is one of those.
yeah, it's an incredible focus of talent with those two leads and this insane Robin Asquith casting as well. But it's a very unusual energy that the actors bring to a almost motionless set to between these two men. I mean, the film could be done in a single room. You don't really need the rest of the.
Yeah, I'd like to know what, because it's been done on the Edinburgh Fringe and that sort of thing. I'd like to see how they did it, because I can imagine it's just done with maybe a dividing screen, a couple of desks and a couple of chairs, you know. Because in the film, there's lots of scenes of Bartleby walking around.
Yeah.
That's how he spends his time. But in the story, you don't see any of Bartleby's life outside of how it's viewed by the accountant or by the lawyer.
The lawyer, it's much more Baroque firm as well, though, isn't it? Because you've got Ginger Nut, and they're a much more explosive and much more involved group of staff.
Yeah.
These ones are just a bit annoyed, but in the book, they're really active.
What do you do? For fun, I mean.
I go for walks. A lot.
Walks?
Yes. I like to look at things.
I see.
Do you? Really?
See? Well, I'm not blind, am I? You're a bit strange.
I'm not strange. I know what I think.
What we're talking about is a moment which completely breaks what's accepted about the environment that you're in. The idea that someone who applies for a job would apply for a job and after work furiously for a period of time, and after a certain period of time, just stop and say, I would prefer not to do that. And you can do anything with that. And people have done many, many things. They've created an economist column, or they've done a sort of explosive exploration of office culture. And in this case, I think they are exploring mental health in a way that's reaching out. At that point, the understanding of things like Asperger's and even depression is very different to the way that we'd think about it now. It was not somewhere where you had a great deal of medication available. That when he is eventually hospitalized, they don't really know what to do with him. They just try to feed him and hope that he'll eat, and he won't. And eventually,
get some sunshine, and
maybe it'll.
But it's
get
interesting
better.
that he does change it in the film to a sort of mental health institution. Rather, it's a prison in the story.
Yes, but I suppose that's the difference. That's the social change. I mean, that's the other thing that I noticed is that in the book he is occupying the building, and the assumption is arrest him. And then in post-war 1960s Britain, which is the health service is there, what are we going to do with this man? Suddenly you give him to the health service rather than the police looking after him. And that becomes a very different, 1960s Britain to 1850s or whatever, New York is a very, very different environment. And that's because you've got this very different social safety net. And so they take him into this hospital, but they're still not able to save him. I mean, in the prison, they have a very bizarre system whereby there's a guy who will feed people for money and
The turnkey.
yes,
Yeah, that's quite nice in the book, because he gives the turnkey some extra money and says he's my friend,
yeah,
look
give him
after
something
him.
nice. That he cares for this man. Again, that kind of doesn't set it up as Bartleby being the fight back against the oppressive boss class, because the oppressive boss class is actually, in both cases, very concerned with Bartleby and very caring.
The Schofield character doesn't represent that which is being portrayed by the concrete and the glass and the millions of people walking to and from grey offices. I mean, he's not like that.
No.
I mean, he's part of it, but he is the sort of human side of all that.
And he doesn't even fit in, because there's a scene halfway through the film where he's having lunch with his other accountant firm friend. And his other accountant firm running friend in this terrible, as you were saying, terrible restaurant, saying, well, I don't understand why you don't fire him. Why don't you fire him? So he doesn't really fit himself. I mean, that's the thing about the accountant, is that he doesn't really fit into the world that he's created. He doesn't fit into his firm per se. He doesn't come across as someone who delights in ordering people around or running things for extreme profit. He's not quite of that world.
No.
That's what's beautiful about him, I think. That's the beautiful performance that Paul Scofield brings, because he doesn't have a great deal to say in which he's able to give us that message. It's the way that he looks at, interacts with. It's the sort of the deep, wet eyes with which he gazes at Bartleby, and the confusion and the hope which Schofield brings to it. The little pauses and the little head movements when he's trying to say angry things and then fails to do so, which is just such a remarkable performance with very little.
The quote that I read from Schofield was, because he'd done Man for All Seasons, got an Oscar, then he'd done King Lear with Peter Brook, and he says, the most devastatingly simple script I've ever read, which is an interesting thing to say about it. I mean, it is very simple. I mean, I suppose it's all about subtext, isn't it? And his internal struggle trying to figure out what Bartleby's up to.
Yes, and he then, because Schofield is so good at that, it becomes our concern in a way. I mean, he guides the way that we understand Bartleby, I think, because in the Herman Melville, Bartleby is less accessible and the narrator is less empathic or less identifiable with. It's shorter, everything moves much more quickly. Watching the struggle that Schofield has then sets up our questions about Bartleby and how do we think about him instead of just someone who refuses work. Because I remember seeing back down to this, I saw it years ago. I'd read the short story again. I was aware of the whole way that I would prefer not to have become a cultural moment of, a cultural symbol of resistance. And then realizing that that's actually not how they do this at all in the film. They do it as a much more complex, and that's down to Schofield. He carries that whole interpretation pretty much on his shoulders alone, I think.
The dead letters thing, it's early on in the film at his interview. He says, what did you do before? And he says, I worked in the dead letters department at the post office. And Schofield's, oh, interesting. I've always wondered what happened to dead letters.
Yes.
He doesn't respond to him. But in the story, you only find out what he did beforehand at the very, very end, like in the last page. And then the whole dead letters, the machinery of the post office and these barrels, what do you call them, kind of rotating drums of letters, that's all becomes part of this sort of montage at the beginning. It's interesting that Anthony Friedman has brought that right to the very start and made a much bigger thing of it than... Not that it's made a bigger thing of it. It's not that Melville made a small thing of it. He just left it as a reveal at the end.
The question is, how much does that matter? And so one of the things that I did while preparing for this podcast was I researched the dead letter office at the post office. And it was invented in London, and it was given the name the dead letter office, but it's not called that anymore. It's called something else. I can't remember, it's called misdirection or something. But the idea is these are the letters that they can't deliver for some reason. There's no return address. So they bring it back to the post office, take it to the dead letter office, and there, under the correct supervision, someone will open the letter, take it out and see what they can find, some evidence they can find that will allow them to give this letter to somebody in due course.
And that still goes on today?
Yeah, it still goes on today.
Amazing.
So it's, in a strange way, it's a slightly more hopeful place than the phrase dead letter office suggests. And that's, I think, the Melville... Well, he worked in dead letter office, that explains it all. But really, what is the dead letter office? It's about trying to allow people to communicate. People fail to communicate, and then you open up and if we can get this to them. It's our mission. So it's a wonderful idea that the dead letter office exists, because it's about, well, they haven't obeyed by the rules. They haven't played the game, but we're not going to stop at that. We're going to then try and do everything we can to make it go further. So it's a weirdly hopeful room. The phrase dead letter office, I think, in of itself is a...
sounds ominous in some way.
And so Melville sticks it at the end as this quite ominous coda. So then Friedman takes up and uses it as a symbol through the film. But I wonder if that's a misfire in a way, because I don't see that it connects in as much of a way. If we try to interpret what happened to Bartleby, I don't see why the dead letter office would cause him. The behaviour at the dead letter office doesn't necessarily drive a man to depression. In fact, it's quite a cheerful place.
Yeah, another interpretation, though, could be, and maybe this is Melville's interpretation, that it's the end of the line for these letters, and it's a pointless activity dealing with dead letters because they're gone. They're all going to do is burn them or whatever, or take the money out and burn them.
But that's not what they do. That's the thing.
No.
But in a way, it's the laziest part of the story. He finishes with the death, and he thinks he better do something else to try and sign it off. I don't think it adds anything to the story. Does it add anything to the film? It possibly does, because there's a sense of modernity that the dead letter office machinery gives this film. This film is also about mechanization of office life. It's about computers. It's about these great spinning steel wheels that happen at the post office. You know, the arrival of the 70s and what it's going to do to the end of the post-war sort of fun. Everything becomes much more metal. So I think it does have a slightly greater purpose in the film than it does in the book, in the short story.
Yeah. Should we move on to Anthony Friedman?
Well, yeah, and I think it's important to understand a bit about him because this is an American story, and I think that's one of the things that is also interesting about the film is that the film does not really get into class, which I think that if you were doing something in the UK in the 60s and 70s, you would be playing on class a lot more. Whereas because it's an American story, an American filmmaker, they don't really enter into the class difference between Schofield and McKerney in a way that, you know, a British filmmaker would probably explore that a little bit more, or a British author would explore that a little bit more. Class is not the issue.
Yeah, and there's no real kind of class distinction between the other people in the office either. They're not.
It's like if this was a Monty Python sketch, it would be very, very class-based. You know, you could pull it out. At that point, people are starting to mess around with the concept of the class difference between the office worker and the boss in a comedic or in a depressing way, like Reginald Perrin really is. I mean, much later, probably 1976, 77.
Something like that, yeah.
Reggie Perrin is kind of Bartleby in a way, but it's played for laughs with a very, very posh boss who's over the top. And this, you know, Richard Perrin, Leonard Rossiter looking and expressing a very John McKerney kind of character. He never quite fitted in his suits.
Yeah, the CJ character in Reggie Perrin, and also the boss in Terry and June. Terry and June, and also The Good Life.
Yeah.
That archetype of the sort of the boss who you have to flatter by playing golf with.
Yeah.
That's what I expected Paul Schofield to be.
Yes.
And he's not like that at all.
I think that's partly Schofield, but I think, again, it's the presence of the American director.
Yeah. It feels a bit like an American film. Like the sort of the long shots of the sort of grubby streets. It feels a bit like Kojak or those films like The Conversation and those kind of films from that era. It's all kind of down at heel and slightly kind of sordid feeling, you know.
But Friedman's also passed through Paris on his way to London. So he's an academic in the States, Harvard, and very well educated, passes through Paris where he tries to get into the French film industry but fails, and then ends up in London where he goes to the London Film School, acquires what he considers to be sufficient knowledge to make a film, and then drops out of London Film School and somehow puts together low but significant budget, because this is not a handheld camera on the cheap guerrilla fly operation. This is a very well made movie with professionals on every part of the making of the movie, and this is his first ever film.
Yeah,
and he comes to this late. He's 10 years older than everyone else in London Film School, but when he's sitting around learning what he needs to learn.
There's hope for us yet.
Yes, exactly.
He does pull together like a fantastic cinematographer, two great lead actors. The score is fantastic.
The jazz, this kind of 60s funky jazz kind of backbeat stuff, which gets slower and slower and slower. At the beginning, it's almost like a deep 70s, not quite Kojak, but maybe that's one of the things that gives you that Kojak feel, because the drums and the guitar and the funky sort of jazz thing at the beginning is quite 70s TV, 70s film, and then it just gets more and more mournful as the film goes on. But yeah, it's an incredible soundtrack for a guy fresh out of film school just to put together.
Yeah,
with, I think, again, American chutzpah. I'm sure that it's easier if you're a Harvard man in London in the 60s and 70s to pull this sort of stuff together. But you can present, I think, more impressively probably if you're an American arriving on these shores then at that point.
And you're a Harvard professor.
Yeah. But then he doesn't make anything. Well, I mean, he can't get anything else off the ground really after this. I think he does.
He has a couple of goes at stuff. Did he do he tried to do a Eugene Ionesco?
The Rhinoceros. Which is very fitting, because Rhinoceros is about everyone is gradually turning into rhinoceroses. Rhinoceri.
Rhinocerums.
Yes. And our hero is the last person standing who won't. It's a kind of vaguely fascistic reference, sort of satire. And at the very end, he tries to become a rhinoceros, but he can't. It's too late. He can't make it into a rhinoceros. So it fits into that sort of Bartleby. What do we do? How do we fit in socially? It's a logical step for him, but he can't quite get it off the ground. And he makes, I think, a short film for the British government warning about the IRA.
Yeah, he did a few kind of like public information
Yeah.
films, that sort of thing. It's an odd career. And then he's written a book about, which apparently is a key text in film schools, something like writing for visual media or something. So he's not an insignificant character, even though he's got a very, very small CV in terms of what he made.
And this is a very sparse film in terms of the dialogue, which shows that he knows how to look. I mean, the first, I don't know, right up until the interview sequence, there's whole chunks of this film where there's absolutely no dialogue whatsoever, and he's doing a lot of showing rather than telling as a director, and it's a very bold and confident first film.
Is that your friend?
Yes.
He's a bit odd, isn't he? He doesn't eat.
In the sanatorium place where Bartleby ends up, there's this character who appears for the first time. She appears twice, and this painfully anorexic young woman.
Well, let's be clear. She's painfully thin. We don't know that she has an eating disorder, but she's painfully thin. And she's in the sanatorium, so it's a reasonable assumption to make. Yeah. She's kind of an is she really there sort of thing.
Yeah, is she like a ghost almost?
Yeah. She does some very valuable plot stuff whereby first of all, she says, he's not eating, and then you're looking for your friend. But she moves the film on quite significantly, but she is a very curious character. And he knows where Bartleby is as soon as he sees her. So she's obviously attached to him. But the fact is, at that point, Bartleby is starving himself to death. He prefers not to eat. And she's standing next to him. So it's almost, is she the... I mean, not quite an angel of death, but she is a character who looks like she will not eat, standing next to a man who said he will not eat. And so there's a lot of kind of, you're trying to work out whether that's symbolic or whether it's coincidental or what her presence signifies, why she's there. She's obviously not in the story at all. So,
no, there's no equivalent character, is there?
And so but because of all the pillars and the kind of almost Greek temple kind of effect of the scenes, it feels like she is almost a Greek theatre style chorus or something. There's something about her that's otherworldly, I think.
The Soho-ness of the film is quite limited.
Well, yes and no, I'd say.
Oh, good. I'm glad you give me some support on that, because the reason I managed to get it in was because there is a couple of shots of, I think, Berwick Street and Great Wimble Street and the Piccadilly Circus. So that for me qualifies it. I just wanted to have the film in the series, to be honest.
I mean, the office is technically at the Barbican.
Yeah.
But I think that it's the journey that Soho is going through at the point that this film is made is very, very similar to what the filmmaker's showing, which is this transitional end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s move from a time of, actually in Soho's case, probably slightly earlier, because the 50s were a great time in Soho. And in the 60s, the big fun was happening in Chelsea and Carnaby Street, and it wasn't quite as much fun.
Yeah.
And then Soho just kind of fell gradually into the
70s slump.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Seed if it's what you like, but it wasn't as vibrant by any means. I have been walking through Soho regularly since the late 70s, and I remember it springing to life again, really, in the early 90s, before there were any bars, when you're just going to the Crown and Two Chairmen, or you're looking for the drinking clubs. And finally there comes the first bar, which is Ricky Tick's on the corner, which is the first ever kind of fashion bar with glass windows, and the first bar that won't let in people with suits. And that must be 91, 92 Ricky Tick's. But up until that point, it's a secretive place, Soho. It becomes, there's a lot of gay bars which have got windows which are shuttered off. It's very, very private, very, very sort of the place that you go to do things that you wouldn't do elsewhere, which really, I think, cements itself in the 60s and the 70s. It's always been a bit of part of Soho life, but it's just that everything else begins to fade away. The Mondo Bongo, espresso culture of the 50s, the jazz, all of that stuff it remains, but it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and Soho becomes less and less groovy. I guess it spends 20 years being less groovy. And I think this film is about what happens to London as it becomes less groovy. Part of the Robin Asquith character, I think, in the way, is that he looks like a hippie, and he looks like the last of the flower children. He's sort of the symbol of what's happened to the 60s. He's got that hint about him with his long hair and his funky kind of dress. He's the end of that period and the crushing conformity of the 70s is coming down around us. And I think that speaks to London, yeah, but also particularly poor Soho, which I think, had a rough time for a while.
It's ironic as well that he went on then to become like the epitome of the 70s.
Yes, well, yes.
Robin
a particular kind of 70s. Well, he became the very epitome of a Soho kind of 70s. I mean, he was in all the Confessions films. He was very, very Raymond Revue bar, wasn't he, in a kind of a way? He was part of the strange British sauce industry, which was very, very lewd, but not really rude. That kind of complicated.
Not erotic.
They're all about frustration, really. That whole genre of films is about not delivering on the frustration and the desire. And it's a kind of a peculiar set of films. I mean, the Carry On series, which obviously is where this all begins, the Carry On series starts with Carry On Sergeant, which is a very straightforward satire on
pop standard 50s film, isn't it? Yeah.
And then it just gradually moves into these films about men trying to get some and women turning them down, broadly speaking, which then spawns the slightly more lewd Robin Askins. And that sort of spills out of where we're sitting
as well. That kind of,
Benny Hill.
Oh, terrible.
Yeah, and I mean, the closing scenes in Benny Hill are quite often of a small man getting chased to his death by crowds of
semi-naked women.
Yeah, and it's what was going on in the British psyche at that particular. We're just entering this film. Bartleby ends, and Britain begins that decade now, where that doesn't seem much fun to me.
Thank you to Stephen Armstrong for meeting up with me to talk about Bartleby. Stephen is a journalist at The Observer, and author of several books, and a freelance film critic. You can often see him on Sky Arts, usually wanging on about some film or director or something. And he has a side gig as the producer of that Soho-adjacent podcast I mentioned. That's called Strippers in the Attic, well worth checking out. And thanks again to Troy Taylor, prolific author, podcaster, and owner of the Museum of American Oddities in Alton, Illinois, for providing that American accent that I just couldn't do. And thank you also to listener Jeff Billington, who was incredibly helpful when I was struggling to find information while I was researching the film. Jeff wrote the booklet to accompany a Blu-ray of Bartleby from Indicator Films, and it's extremely informative. To find links to that Blu-ray, which you should definitely buy by the way, and to all sorts of information about Stephen Armstrong, Troy Taylor, Bartleby and John C. Colt, head over to the show notes for this episode at sohobitespodcast.com, unless of course you would prefer not to. I am contractually obliged to request your support for the show. There are two ways to do this. You can post a review, or you can give me all your money, or both. Just go to sohobitespodcast.com/review or sohobitespodcast.com/donate. You don't have to give me all your money, by the way, just most of it. We are grateful for the continued support of the Museum of Soho, who allow me to do my recordings for the show in their gallery in the All Is Joy building at 75 Dean Street. Check them out at mosoho.org.uk. Soho Bites is produced by me, Dom DeLargy, and is based on an original idea by Dr. Jing Young. In the next episode, we'll be talking about a low-budget police drama from 1952. That's coming out at the start of April, so see you then, and bye for now.